Yes, so I'm Amar Griffin, and one of our speakers this morning, who actually works in business, said that he felt he was the cuckoo in the nest. And I have to say, I feel very much the same. As the historian, I feel what I'm doing is very different to what I've been listening to today. On the plus side, I think history is very accessible and easy to understand, so I'm sure you'll have absolutely no difficulty understanding what I'm going on about, whereas economics arguably is a little bit trickier to follow if you've not got some expertise. Okay, so I'm a historian of the British Industrial Revolution. I've been looking at working class autobiographies and trying to think about how life changed for workers as we transitioned from an agricultural, agrarian, pre-industrial nation into a modern industrial nation. So what I want to do in this paper is come right back to the beginning, come back to the late 18th century, the early 19th century, and think a little bit more about how we transitioned from a society in which innovation was not important and not present into one in which it became ubiquitous. And I want to start with the story of an old gamekeeper, farm worker, born in the 1890s, told when he was writing his memoirs in the 1970s. It was about a gentleman farmer whose gardener had died and therefore needed to employ a new one. He put an advert in a paper, and a highly trained gardener arrived to inquire whether the post was still free. The gentleman said to him, "See those cabbages over there? I want you to plant those cabbages in the hole that I've already dug out, but I want you to put the cabbages in with the leaves down and the roots up." Well, the gardener was very bemused because this isn't the right way to plant a cabbage, and he started to plant them the right way round. The gentleman said, "That's enough, my man. I like a man that'll do what he's told, and you're not doing what I've told. You're doing the reverse to that." So he had to go. A second one came, and he did exactly the same thing. He, of course, had to go as well. Then a tramp came looking for work. He was given the same instructions, and lo, he started to ram the cabbages into the holes with the leaves down and the roots pointing upwards. And the gentleman was delighted. He said, "You're the man I've been looking for. You're doing what you're told. Now, turn that cabbage round the right way and plant it properly." And my old gamekeeper thoroughly approved of this story. He says, "That's one thing I've done nearly always in my life. I've done what my masters told me, though I've expected them to take responsibility." Now, that was a gamekeeper. I want to contrast his attitude to the work taken, to that of John Howlett. He was born in the same decade, in the 1890s, and he started his life as an apprentice at an engineering works, and he moves into the car industry in its very early phases, and he develops a piston ring and sets up a very successful business in time, making these piston rings. Now, Howlett's style had never been to do what he was told with no questions asked. He liked to inquire and to innovate. He reminisced in his autobiography, written in the 1970s, about the excitement of learning about machine constructions in his teens. He said, "I found my mind deeply engaged in problems. It was very satisfying, the moment of recognition. It was also satisfying to have a little success, to solve problems. It made me try all the harder and concentrate all the more." And this pattern of inquiry was repeated throughout his working life, encouraging him to move into the car industry in the early days, setting up his own workshop, and ultimately culminating in his invention of the piston ring. I'd say that these two views embody two different approaches to work. A pre-industrial model where obedience and deference are highly prized, and a post-industrial or a modern approach to work where resourcefulness and enterprise are what are most highly valued. Now, clearly, they can both exist at the same time. My men were born in the same decade, and they're at work through the 20th century. You can have both of these models at once. But at the same time, I think we can say that in 19th century Britain and across the modern world, we've seen really a very remarkable and very rapid switch from one model being dominant to the other one being dominant. And as a historian, I want to think about why. And in this paper, I'm going to be using working class autobiographies like the ones I've just sampled in order to have a think about this question. Well, in order to think about how we transition into a society where resourcefulness and innovation are most highly valued, I think we've got to start with the Industrial Revolution. Now, historians will continue to debate the fine details of what caused and characterised the Industrial Revolution, but we can all agree, no matter how we actually define it, something very monumental happened when the Industrial Revolution occurred, with a significant expansion of the economy, the movement of labour out of agriculture and into manufacturing, the making of things, and a substantial increase in the number and variety of the different types of employment available. I think all of this played a role in bringing about new ideas and new attitudes towards work. Let's start by thinking about the increasing complexity of the economy. I think this just opens up choice so that individuals can align their interests with their work in a way that wasn't possible before. I've got an autobiographer who was at work in the 1650s, long before industrialisation, and he didn't want to work in agriculture. He said, ploughing, sowing, haymaking, reaping, hedging, ditching, thrashing and dunging amongst cattle are all drudgery. But what else is there for a man to do in 17th century Britain? There's very little else to do. He eventually finds work with a whitester, that's bleaching yarn, but in fact when he starts the job, he discovers there's not that much demand for bleached yarn, and the whitester spends most of the year running a farm, so he's put to farm work rather than doing the bleaching. There's nothing really else for him to do except to join the army, to go to sea, or to carry on working in agriculture, and what he does is go to sea. By the 19th century, the expansion of the economy has just vastly increased the array of different kinds of jobs that are available. I've got an example of George Healy living just outside London in the middle of the 19th century. After leaving home, he works in a silk mill, a cellar, a waiter, a potboy and a milkman. That's 16 different occupations, if you weren't counting, before setting up in just one of those lines of work as a hat maker. Later in the century, Albert Pugh was a navvy on the railways. Now, you might think that being a navvy on the railway is an unskilled job and there's not much to it. But after becoming a navvy, in the space of just 2 or 3 years, he moves across 8 distinct types of employment within a very rapid period of time. He does stone breaking, fatting and dodging the wagons, point turning, tool carrying, operating a steam crane, engine cleaning, firing a locomotive engine, and this was the height of his ambition, driving the engines. So then what we can see is happening here is that as the economy becomes more complex, a very, very wide range of employments becomes open to men, allowing men, and I really do mean men at this time, to line up their interests with employment in a way that hadn't been possible in a pre-modern economy. In addition, I think we should draw attention to the nature of work. The nature of work in manufacturing is innately more challenging and throws up problems that need to be solved. Ned Cowan was born in 1903, and he spent 55 years as a miner. In his autobiography, he said that people often thought that mining was unskilled, but actually every coal face has a unique set of challenges in the way that it's located and the things that you're going to have to do in order to get the coal out. Clearly, I think much of manufacturing is very different by its nature from agriculture, where the cabbages really go in the same way and there's not a lot of innovation that's required. To this, I think we should also add the nature of employment contracts. Farmers tend to want to employ their employees on year-long contracts. They need to have labour in position when the harvest comes in, and that means tying your workforce into a year-long contract so that you've got them there when you need them. And often through a lot of the year, there's not an awful lot that you need them to do, but you need to hold on to them so that they'll be there to get the harvest in for you. Industrial employers have no interest in holding on to a workforce that they're not using at that particular time. So they will always employ, or in Britain at this time, they're always employing their employees by the piece. Everybody gets paid for the thing that they do and not for the amount of time that they spend at work. As a consequence, workers have an incentive to use their ingenuity to reduce the amount of time that they spend on a task that simply isn't present for somebody who's on a year-long contract. The size of employees, I think, is also part of our story. Most work in the early phases of industrialisation is still organised in small general firms and workshops, where all manner of different work is undertaken. Francis Crittall described taking over his father's small ironmongery business in the 1880s and having to turn his hand to every single aspect of the business. Bedsteads, lawnmowers, bar iron, horseshoes, tools, hardware paints, oils, metal gates and fences, nails and screws and paraffins. These were all the things that he had to master in order to be able to service the business. And with hindsight, he could see that this very broad grounding formed the foundation for his later invention of metal-cased windows, transforming him from a very small business owner into a large employee and a very wealthy man as well. Clearly, there are a number of features of the manufacturing economy that emerges when a nation industrialised that are more favourable to the creation of an innovative and an enterprising workforce. But I think there's also something else that's at stake, and in the few minutes that I've got left, I'd like to talk about that, and I think it's about people's attitude towards risk. In a side project, I've recently been thinking about the history of hunger and the role that the Industrial Revolution played in eliminating hunger in Victorian Britain. One of the things that I found is that as the risk of hunger diminishes, adults are more likely to engage in risky forms of behaviour. And I think this patterns of behaviour, the behavioural change, is actually also part of our story. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. In the 19th century, gentlemen investigators began looking at incomes and expenditure in poor households. When I looked at this material in detail, I found pretty much what you might expect. The spending on food was higher in industrial areas and lower in rural ones. And this was because family incomes are higher in industrial areas, and unsurprisingly, what families are doing, they're investing much of that extra income that they're able to earn by moving to the city in purchasing for themselves and their family a better diet. Well, I thought this was important evidence for the way, in fact, the Industrial Revolution, I mean, in British historiography, it's always presumed that the Industrial Revolution had a negative impact on people's living standards, and it was a bad news for the workers. And I've really tried to argue against this in a large body of work. And I felt this evidence on the diets really supported my idea that the Industrial Revolution actually is very good, even for the poor, even in its early phases. You don't have to wait till the 20th century. Even in the 1820s, even in the 1830s, industrialisation is good for the workers. When I tried to send this off to a journal, there was all sorts of problems, and basically I was told that it couldn't be right, because we all know that the Industrial Revolution wasn't good for living standards, and I needed to read Engels and go back to my figures and work out where I'd gone wrong. It just couldn't be right. So I thought, well, I've got all these autobiographies. Let's look at the autobiographies and see if they can kind of help to support what I'm saying here. And I've been through all of these autobiographies, about 350 in all, trying to think about when they talk about hunger. And in some ways, it supports what I was saying before. Hunger is much higher in rural areas than it is in industrial areas. About 40% of my rural autobiographers mention going hungry, and only about 20% of those in industrial areas. And yet, I was still quite struck that that's still quite a lot of hunger that's left in the industrial areas, and it's much higher, really, than we should have expected, given that the incomes are so much higher. And when I started to look more closely, it became evident that although incomes are higher, so is human behaviour changing in the industrial areas, with the result that rising incomes are not just eliminating hunger in a simple, straightforward way that we might hope. Just look at this in a tiny bit more detail. In rural areas, hunger was caused by low incomes and lack of work. Children, particularly children, but also adolescents and even adult men can go hungry because of harvest failures leading to a spike in prices, or just because of chronic low wages. Children in particular suffer from their father's chronic low wages. The economy is not rich enough to provide food for everybody in the rural, unindustrialised part of the country to escape hunger. In the industrial areas, however, people almost never go hungry for this reason. In these districts, we see that men can get a good wage, but they aren't always choosing to work hard and earn that wage, or they're not transferring their wages to the wife so that the wife can then go about her business of turning the money into the food so that the children don't go hungry. We see two things happening. They're either choosing not to work intensively, and it's quite boring going down and working in a mine, and it's hard work, and you can see why people don't want to work 6 days a week. If you can earn just enough to get by on 2 days, some men are choosing to do that rather than to work intensively. The other big factor is men are spending a large amount, they're keeping their wages to themselves and spending on alcohol. So there's a lot of drinking going on, so the wage is kind of getting stuck with the man and not entering into the household, and thereby eliminating hunger in the way I'd expected. But either way, what we can see is that for centuries, men have been under this obligation to labour full-time, all the hours of the day, up until the day that they die. They're obligated to labour, and they're obligated to provide for their children. And men have done that. And in rural Britain, they're still doing that, but even when they do that, they can't earn enough to stop their children going hungry. In the industrial area, that's broken down. Men are not feeling under the obligation to work a long, intensive week. They're not feeling obligated to provide for their wife and children. They're simply choosing to do different. Behaviour has changed, and attitudes to risk, and the need to conform to social norms has really started to melt away and dissipate. And I think that's part of our story about innovation as well. So in conclusion, clearly I want to make a case for the role of the Industrial Revolution in promoting new patterns of working life in just the way that I think Ned has described so eloquently. And I also want to posit the Industrial Revolution as playing a pivotal role in causing the transformations that occur at this time. Clearly, the Industrial Revolution created a larger and a more complex economy which allows individuals to line up their interests with what they want to do and to flourish in the workplace. Greater wealth, however, also helps to remove individuals from hunger, and I think this helps to trigger new patterns of behaviour. Innovation requires risk, and individuals who do not fear for their hunger are much more likely to take risks than those who are. Thank you.
Right, so my name is Anton Howes. I'm a PhD student at King's College London, just finishing up, and I've been asked, thanks very much to the Centre, to present my findings for the very, very first time. So I'll be arguing that the British Industrial Revolution, the start of modern, innovation-led economic growth, was due to the spread of an observable ideology of innovation. Now, I think the best way to figure out why innovation increased in this period is really to look at the individuals who innovated themselves. So, I constructed a new data set of inventors active between 1651, the end of a highly destructive civil war, the English Civil War, right up until 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. Really the symbolic pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution. So I expected to see a kind of before and after effect. The sample was taken from older, smaller inventor lists, such as Allen and MacLeod and Nuvolari, I've mentioned there. And I also took all of the inventors and innovators and tweakers mentioned in key works, like Joel Mokier's The Enlightened Economy. I also tried to correct for the usual biases you see in favour of those who took out patents or those who are active in more famous industries, you know, steam, coal, cotton, etc., by including some of these other sources who concentrated more on things like furnishings and agriculture and gardening, etc., all of which also saw substantial innovation in the period. And the details of these inventors were primarily from a range of secondary sources, such as the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, but also from some primary sources as well. So I did some archival research to figure out the missing gaps, if you will, in what we know about these inventors' lives, what it is that they were doing. And so in total, I found that my sample consists of 677 innovators active between 1651 and 1851. That is, inventing for the very first time in that period. Right, and it's also worth noting that these 677 innovators were responsible for thousands of innovations between them. So we're talking lots of, at least 3,500 patents between them, but actually over half of them didn't take out any patents whatsoever. So we're talking about lots and lots of small improvements, small tweaks, some product innovations as well. And so this really represents a pretty good sample of what was happening in the period. And this is what the acceleration innovation really looks like. So this graph shows the number of individuals innovating for the first time in each quarter of a century. So you go from around 10 to 30 in the very early quarter centuries here. That is new individuals innovating for the very first time to well over 100 in the early 19th century. And it's also worth noting, by the way, that a lot of these innovations, a lot of the innovation of the Industrial Revolution was applied to all industries, from agriculture to watchmaking, not simply in the kind of poster boy industries of coal, cotton, steam, iron, etc. And then it's only after these innovations that you start to see these later transformative effects on society and the economy as they begin to be adopted. So what explains this? I will argue that it was caused by an ideology of innovation, but the principal alternatives are also worth very briefly mentioning. So one of the existing hypotheses is the hypothesis that inventors and innovators reacted to the greater demands of harder working consumers, for example, or from the greater demands from foreign trade. Secondly, you have this institutions hypothesis, the idea that it became uniquely easier in Britain for innovators to appropriate the rewards from their inventions, for example, through some kind of exogenous changes to the patent system. Thirdly, you have the human capital hypothesis, which mainly focuses on the idea that British workers were somehow more skilled than workers elsewhere, particularly on the continent or in prior societies. You also have these cultural hypotheses, and there's two principal ones that I think are worth mentioning in literature. The first of these is that there was some kind of spillover of norms from the scientific revolution into the industrial sphere. This is usually associated with the economic historian Joel Mokyr. The second one is that there was this general shift in dignity for the middling kind of bourgeois classes, encouraging them to try their hand, to have a go at innovation for the very first time, usually associated with Deirdre McCloskey. Now, I don't have the time to go into any detail about these alternatives. However, I should note that from my data, I found that while these were all certainly important influences on innovation, potentially directing them down certain avenues into particular industries, none of them actually seem to have actually caused innovation. They don't actually seem to have caused individuals to innovate for the very first time, to induce them to innovate. Indeed, my data suggests that there was a set of more fundamental ideas in Britain at the time than those existing cultural hypotheses would suggest. So I'd like to introduce this other explanation, which I believe better explains why innovation accelerated for the very first time in this period. And that's that there was this ideology, a kind of ethos of innovation, made up of these two key elements. The first of which is this mentality of improvement. The second is the commitment to advancing improvement. Now, I'll go through both of these in turn. Now, the mentality of improvement, what is this improving mentality? Essentially, instead of working at a task each day, whether skilled or unskilled, it's about finding some way to make a process better and more efficient, or envisaging an improved product to better satisfy consumers. Now, a very good example of this, I'd like to introduce you here to John Kay, who in 1733 was responsible for one of the most famous innovations of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the cotton industry, which was the flying shuttle. Now, it's worth noting about the flying shuttle that this was an ingenious improvement on what was already a very ancient and quite sophisticated piece of kit, the loom, the weaving loom. And also, as I've tried to show with this illustration that I found, that it was really only made up of two wooden boxes and really a piece of string so that you could shuttle across the loom. It's really not much more complicated than that. And also, it's introduced initially not to the cotton industry, for which it's become famous, but to the woolen industry, which was an extremely ancient industry. Thus, the flying shuttle used ordinary materials, wood and string. It was applied to ancient technologies, such as the loom, and also in well-established industries, i.e. wool. So essentially, it could have been done at any time before. There's really no other barrier to it. Essentially, this, I think, is where the improving mentality appears to have made the difference. Now, I'd like to highlight two other traits of this improving mentality. The first of which, firstly, is this change in approach to the world. Now, the second one is that it could be applied to everything. And the third, that it spread, this is the crucial point, I think, that it spread through contact with already innovative individuals. So let's have a look at this idea that it could be applied to everything. Essentially, the improving mentality could be applied to basically any industry. As I mentioned, there was innovation from agriculture to watchmaking, and not just in certain sectors of the economy. And in fact, I think it could be applied even more broadly than that. So I'd like to introduce you to William Fairbairn, who was an improver and tweaker of steamships and iron bridges in particular. And he appears to have hacked romance. So he practiced writing romantic letters to his crush during his apprenticeship by attempting to reverse engineer the published correspondence between two lovers that was published in a magazine. As he puts it himself, in this way, I inadvertently rendered one of the strongest passions of our nature, i.e. love, or romance, subservient to the means of improvement. So here we see that improving mentality coming in for the very first time, and by his own admission. Now, thirdly, there was this idea that it spread from person to person. And actually, I found that this happens almost without exception. You can trace back the line of inspiration from one innovator to another, often through personal contact. So, for example, this is a great example of it, based on the autobiography, the memoirs of Richard Lovell Edgeworth, shown on the left here. Shown on the right here. So in 1766, Edgeworth was simply an Irish gentleman. He attended an exhibition of curiosities and automata, kind of mechanical robots of some kind, and he struck up a conversation with the curator. And as he puts it here, he spoke of Dr. Erasmus Darwin, that's Charles Darwin's grandfather, also an innovator, and described to me a carriage which the doctor had invented. And what happens next is the really interesting bit. Because, as he puts it himself, it was at this point that he determined to try his skill at coachmaking and to endeavour to obtain similar advantages in a carriage of his own construction. So you can directly see by his own admission here that he is inspired to innovate for the very first time by hearing about the inventions of this other person. Now, what's also interesting here is that this improving mentality appears to be applied to self-education in very many cases. So at least about 20% of the innovators on my list appear to have had absolutely no prior skills in the industries in which they later innovated. And then there's a further proportion, though I can't quite remember off the top of my head, who had, so some of their initial inventions were related to their skills and some of them weren't. And so you see that there's this application of the improving mentality to self-education, what today might be termed upskilling, I suppose. It's also worth noting that Edgeworth, this unskilled Irish gentleman, goes on to also develop various instruments, mechanical instruments, and also agricultural machinery as well. So, to recap, what was this mentality of improvement? Firstly, it's this change in the approach to the world. And this explains how you have innovation bubbling up for the very first time in very ancient industries, not just in the kind of the forward industries like cotton and steam and coal, which are all very exciting, but using ordinary materials applied to ancient technologies and in well-established industries. Secondly, it appears to have been universally applicable. This explains the sheer range of industries that experience innovation, from agriculture to watchmaking, as I mentioned, but also these frequent instances of self-education. And third, it spreads through contact with particularly innovative individuals. And also it's worth mentioning serendipitously as well, so indirectly, for example, by reading about inventions for the first time and thinking, that's what I want to do. It's also worth noting on this last point, on this third point, that the lines of inspiration for nearly all of the 677 innovators in my list can be traced back to just a handful of individuals active innovating in the late 17th century, namely Isaac Newton, who less famously invents the reflecting telescope in the 1660s, Robert Hooke, an inventor of various microscopes and also the watch balance spring watch. Christian Huygens, which is a little unusual because he was Dutch, the inventor of the pendulum, and also independently of the balance spring watch. And also, this one you probably won't have heard of, Thomas Sydenham, who was a medical innovator active in the late 17th century. But innovation had happened before, so think of ancient Greece, think of Leonardo da Vinci active in the 15th and 16th centuries. So there must be something else that made the difference. Why was this time different? Why was it that Britain around the 18th century saw this remarkable and unprecedented acceleration of innovation? Well, I would like to argue that it's the second element of this ideology of innovation, this observable ideological change. And really, it's this commitment to spreading, diffusing, disseminating innovation. Now, I'd like to show you a little bit of data. So this is from the data that I collected. And as you can see here, so about half of the inventors were actually paying money to societies for the diffusion of innovation, for the diffusion of knowledge. So essentially putting their money where their hearts lay in that respect. Another 60% were publishing. That's putting descriptions of their inventions out into the wider world, writing encyclopedia articles, translating foreign works and bringing their innovations over to Britain, or even vice versa. About a third of them were teaching, lecturing, or even just directly funding education. About a third of them were sharing to societies or sharing their inventions to the public at large through public exhibitions and the like. And this other sharing category that I've included here includes things like informal advice offered by some innovators to others. So, for example, George Stephenson, the very famous railway pioneer, he would apparently offer advice to locomotive drivers while he was simply waiting for his train on the platform. So really trying to give them tips and tricks and the ways that they can tweak and improve things. However, it's when we look at all of these together that we see the sheer scale of almost how universal this tendency appears to have been. 83% of innovators appear to have had some signs of this commitment to spreading and diffusing innovation. And it's also worth noting, by the way, that most of the remainder of that are simply those innovators about whom we know very, very little in any case. So 83% should be considered a lower bound. After all, the absence of evidence when it comes to this kind of historical data is not necessarily evidence of absence. Also, this understates the significance of non-innovating enthusiasts as well, the sort of proselytizers and preachers for innovation who weren't necessarily innovators themselves. So my research threw up, for example, that Edinburgh University appears to have been a particular hub of not just innovating lecturers, but those who would inspire other lecturers to then spread this ideology of innovation further to some of their students. At the same time, very, very few of them appear to have been anti-sharing. Now, the way I tried to measure this was those who were using secrecy, those who would sue people for patent infringement, or those who tried to extend their patents by lobbying Parliament for essentially to create their monopoly and leave it for longer. And as you can see here from this little Venn diagram I've done here, only 3%, 22 individuals out of the 677 seem to have been completely against sharing. So actually there's a very large overlap in terms of those with very pro-sharing activity and those with very anti-sharing activity. Now these 22 are, they're pretty extreme. For example, there's the gunmaker Joseph Manton, who sues his own brother for patent infringement. Or there's the iron pioneer Isaac Wilkinson, who on multiple occasions sues his own son. But these, it's worth noting, are really just exceptions to the rule. Now, this overlap, I think, does need some further explanation. And I think it merely reflects the mixed motivations of innovators for their innovative activity. Like any other political or religious ideology, the ideology of innovation seems to have been held to varying degrees and with different motives in mind. So you get the altruistic, ascetic proselytizers, you get the more self-interested, prudent or business-like individuals, famously James Watt. Or there were those who pursued fame, prestige and glory. So Richard Lovell Edgeworth, who we looked at earlier, was really doing most of his innovation in terms of his appropriation activity. He was submitting it to societies and getting medals and rewards and accolades. Or there were simply those who I think were just animated by their sheer enthusiasm and excitement for the process of innovation itself. Ultimately, I think most of them were in between or even a mixture of all of them. Richard Roberts is a great example of this mixture. Richard Roberts was the inventor of the steam-powered loom in the 1820s. And so he selfishly extended patents. He selflessly helped to found the Mechanics Institute in Manchester. But ultimately, he was impoverished by his addiction to experimentation and innovation. So the evidence I've collected seems to suggest that it's these two elements that cause the unprecedented acceleration and persistence of innovation. Together, they constitute the ideology of innovation. It's worth noting, like any popular ideology, the mentality of improvement is both surprisingly simple, yet utterly compelling. But like any other political ideology or religion, it needs its evangelists, its proselytizers, its boosters for it to spread and for it to take root. Indeed, I think it's this second element that explains why the ideology appears to today be actually quite alive and well, and even spread across the world, from Britain to America to France to Germany and to other countries too. I also think it's why this wave of innovation and progress associated with the British Industrial Revolution has never stopped. Now, lastly, I'd just like to run through some of the implications for today. If I'm correct, then I hope that this may provide us with some insight into that holy grail of long-term economic growth, how to boost the underlying rate of innovation. Secondly, policymakers, I think, need to take seriously the importance of individual innovators. So the freer movement of people, for example, might help, as I think some previous speakers alluded to, though it's also worth bearing in mind that like minds tend to congregate. So in the 18th century, budding innovators flocked to Birmingham to join James Watt, whereas today they'll go and try and join Peter Thiel in the San Francisco Bay Area. If policymakers want their countries to innovate, they need to consider how to attract and retain not necessarily their brightest, but their most innovative. Fundamentally, however, and this is the third point, we need the Edgeworths and the Darwins, I guess the Peter Thiels of today, to do as much as they can to spread this philosophy of improvement. Now, they certainly do to a very large extent. However, it's also worth recognizing that anyone can do the same. These proselytizers and boosters, as I mentioned, don't necessarily need to be innovators themselves. Indeed, I hope that this presentation, merely by mentioning so many innovators, might inspire somebody in the audience to innovate for the first time, even though I've never tinkered or improved things myself. Thank you very much.
So I have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity given to me by Ned that I'm my own timekeeper, since there's nobody to sort of shut me up in 10 minutes. So there's an enormous moral hazard problem here. On the other side, I usually sort of say the same thing at all center conferences, and in different words. So for 13 years, I've been saying the same thing, and I would have said it, but my hesitation in expounding at length about what I have said before 13 times is truncated by Peter Thiel's talk, where he more or less said everything that I usually try to say in a much more cogent and convincing sort of way. And the other issue is that about a third of what I was going to say was about Gilfie's paper. Gilfie was the combat, so now I have this huge chunk of time which I control, but I don't have a whole lot to say. Let me start off by saying what I usually say, is that innovation that delivers the goods, and by delivers the goods I mean both in a material sense and in the sense of providing a good life and the satisfactions of life, is highly diverse and highly inclusive. And the more diverse and the more inclusive, the more it delivers the goods. These two things go hand in hand. By diversity, I mean the diversity in terms of activities involved with an innovation. So unlike the previous paper, I do not think of innovation, I do not equate innovation with invention, and I think much of the previous talk was almost entirely about invention rather than innovation. So I think of people like madmen, people who are involved in intellectual property law, people who are, dare I say it, even involved in finance, are part of this innovation system. And a diverse innovation system sort of delivers the goods better. And in order for an innovation system to be diverse, you need it to be inclusive. So that it needs to include people with a large number of talents, with a rather different set of beliefs and preferences. If you believe this to be true, that means there's very, very little that you can say about innovation in general. And in fact, to the extent that you do make generalizations about how to make things more innovative or better, you could actually do more harm than good. So if you have a formula for making a society more innovative, or making an economy more innovative, you through unintended consequences are very liable to do harm. The best we can do, I think, is to look at specific problems and specific situations. So to give you an example, Charlie mentioned this morning about why is it that if Japan is so, quote-unquote, non-innovative, why is it that there's so much innovation on the factory floor? And then the question that raises to me is that Japan is not a thing. Japan is a collection of a large number of activities. The kinds of things that happen on the factory floor are very different from the kinds of things that happen in the service sector. The service sector is terrible, and so forth. I happen to think that the American innovation system in general is highly inclusive and highly diverse, with the exception of healthcare, which is what I've been studying recently. And therefore, one should really think about what are the issues with healthcare that make it that make it less innovative. So I am sympathetic to these papers and the other papers which sort of want to give you a general formula, but I am skeptical. Let me get to the two papers, since Gilfie is sort of looking much the worse for what I've done there. So Anton's paper posits a causal relationship between what he calls ideology, and it's an ideology of improvement and the rate of innovation. So he says the ideology drives improvement. The ideology, in turn, he unpacks into a mentality of improvement and a commitment to propagating improvement. I had a little bit of difficulty with the second part of the claim, but let's stick to the first. Interestingly, I don't know how many of you picked up on it. Emma had a completely different causal relationship. So in Emma's world, the economy changes first; it becomes more manufacturing oriented. And the change in the economy, the change in its complexity, then creates opportunities for, induces or gives scope for changes in attitudes. And in Anton's view, it goes the other way. That it's the changes in attitudes that basically lead to a much higher rate of innovation. Now, to me, the obsession with whether A causes B or B causes A is kind of unnecessary. And in physics, at least, we think of PV is equal to nRT, and we don't care whether P causes T or P. So let's just take the notion that these things are. These things go hand in hand, and I think that there's a powerful connection between attitudes and changes in the kind of activity. Where I was actually puzzled by Emma's description of attitudes. She painted a picture of post-industrial revolution manufacturing as offering a much broad scope for problem solving, for being innovative, for being creative, and so forth. And my reading of it is that certainly there were much more of these. There were imaginative, creative, forward-looking people, and they had much to do with advancing the state of technological knowledge in the Industrial Revolution. But, and this is an important but, this was not the case for most people on the factory floor, at least in America. So I don't know whether there was more scope for problem solving on the factory floor than in the farm. But I find it hard to believe that there was more scope for problem solving on Ford's assembly line than there was in a workshop. But then it struck me that Emma was talking about Britain and the UK. And there's this vastly underestimated outside business schools scholar, Alfred Chandler, who has drawn a sharp distinction between the UK on the one hand and the US and Germany on the other, in which he says the US and Germany were very much into economies of scale and scope. So they embraced large-scale manufacturing to a much greater degree than did the UK, which may explain why, in spite of this great flowering of invention in the United Kingdom, and in spite of the fact that there was more scope for people to exercise their imagination, the UK fell far behind the US and Germany, which again underlines my point about what one needs in an economy which delivers the goods is a diverse set of activities. Some people are trying to do new stuff. Some people who are trying to scale up stuff which already exists. Some people who are tweaking stuff on the factory floor to improve efficiency and so forth. And so try to impose on it one particular model is dangerous. Emma also had a different, towards the end of her talk, had an observation about hunger and attitudes towards innovation. I don't think anybody, any reasonable person would argue with the notion that the Industrial Revolution has made people less hungry and generally better off. Absolutely, absolutely the case, and this is wonderful. Where I find Emma's apparently causal relationship there tricky is I thought I heard her say the following, something along the lines that innovation requires risk-taking, hungry people are less likely to be risk-takers, therefore the removal of hunger is what drives innovation. And there's a variant of this claim that has been offered in previous conferences, which is it's not hunger per se. Hunger is very stark. It's income security. So if you make things less risky for people, more people will take risks. I have a lot of difficulty with this particular claim. I mean, sort of, my father grew up in dire poverty and was always hungry, and he was a daredevil. And I was never hungry, and I'm a professor. You know, so it is, and he would basically say, look, I started with nothing, I may end with nothing, sort of, who cares? And furthermore, and this is a point which Peter Thiel made this afternoon. Innovation is not about risk-taking, or entrepreneurship is not about risk-taking. It is about having it's not being blind to things that may go wrong. But innovators or entrepreneurs are not sort of don't go out and say, where's the risk, I want to take it, as may some congenital gamblers, and so it's not clear that sort of doing things that remove the risk of innovative activity are necessarily a good or desirable thing. So an economy which is broadly innovative requires some people who are really sort of going crazy, as it were, people who start Federal Express. It also requires a whole bunch of people who are not going crazy, who are tinkering on the margins. And do we really want to create a set of incentives that encourages more people to go crazy, quote unquote, and less people to do this sort of small c creativity kind of innovation, which again is an important part of the innovation process. So the bottom line is, beware of conflating a particular kind of vividly interesting breakthrough kind of innovative activity with what makes the economy as a whole or society as a whole innovative, and beware of solutions that push you in that direction. I mean, I'm done.